Welcome to this webinar, Part L, What do the changes mean for the sector, which is sponsored by Trimble Viewpoint. I am Thomas Lane, Technical Editor of Building Magazine. An updated version of Part L, the building regulation controlling operational energy use, took effect on the 15th of June. A new building regulation, Part 0, or Part O I should say, which controls the overheating of homes, was introduced at the same time. Part F, which regulates ventilation, was also amended. The regulation exercising housebuilders is a new version of Part L, as this requires a 31% reduction in carbon emissions over the previous version. This is estimated to cost around £4,000 per home. Today, our expert panel will give an overview of the changes, which includes how to mitigate the cost of compliance. They will also discuss software tools to help make compliance easier. I'm joined by Benedict Wallbank, BIM Strategy and Partnerships Manager, Trimble Viewpoint, Austin Bates, Director and Head of Building Performance at Ramble Buildings UK, and Peter Roberts, the Head of Quality at St George and St Joseph. So the format of today's session will be that each panelist will speak for approximately 10 minutes, and once the formal presentations are finished, we will take questions from the audience. So please submit your questions after the presentations are finished, and we'll answer as many of these as we can. In terms of our speakers, Ben will give an overview of the new standards for housing and how software tools can simplify compliance. Austin will give an engineer's perspective, including the costs of compliance. And finally, Peter will talk about the challenges posed by the new compliance regime and how to make this easier. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Benedict Wallbank from Trimble Viewpoint. So over to you, Ben.
I'd better unmute myself then. Right, so can everybody see my screen and in particular my intro slide?
Yes, it's all there.
Yeah, super. Okay, so I'm just going to spend this next 10 minutes really giving an introduction, because my fellow speakers are really dealing with this at the coalface, so to speak, and I'm working for a software provider. But I'm going to try and put these changes into some context so that we can see that they just haven't landed out of nowhere. I'm going to give a summary of what we're being asked to do, and then in very broad terms, I'll look at, again, putting it into the context of what we've been told is coming down the line, what role technology can play, and what types of tools we should perhaps be looking at. So, the first thing to say is that we really shouldn't be surprised at this new change to the regulations. This is all part of the government's drive towards net zero by 2050, which is a really onerous target that we're going to have to make. So this is just one actually quite substantial step towards that. But really, if we think about it, this drive has been around very much longer. If I think back to when I was a trainee architect at the Bartlett back in the early 1980s, even then I can remember being hauled over the coals for just copying some Mitchell's details, which had cold bridging. And we've seen an incremental series of updates to Part L, each of which becomes more onerous in terms of heat loss and how carbon is consumed within our buildings. Wait a minute. So, I'd urge everybody not to think that this is just another raft of bureaucracy coming to our industry. This is part of this much broader challenge that we all face of how we reduce our consumption and effectively save the planet. But it also is, more importantly for us in terms of what we're producing, it's ensuring quality for our customers. So there are 5 new approved documents. and these became mandatory. Remember, a regulation is a mandatory thing. It's not a standard which you can choose to follow or not. So this became mandatory from the 15th of June, and actually in Wales, it's the 23rd of November. The conservation of heat and power are the two Part L parts, and ventilation is Part F. And in addition to that, there's an entirely new and approved document covering overheating. But we're going to concentrate particularly on Part L today. And these new rules and regulations are for dwellings and for all buildings other than dwellings, and they deal with new build and our existing building fabric. So effectively, that's all your building work. So everything that you do, in terms of building and buildings is affected by these regulations. So these new standards represent a really substantial increase in the regulatory standards from the last version of Part L. It's actually a 31% decrease in dwelling CO2 emissions. It's a 25% decrease in CO2 emissions from buildings other than dwellings. And these are really substantial changes. And I think the thing that I draw to everybody's attention is that part of this is a much keener attention to thermal bridging. Obviously, the more that we insulate our buildings, the greater the dangers, obviously not just of heat loss, but also things like condensation that we're going to get from any cold bridge that exists. So there is much greater emphasis now on the whole question of thermal bridging. And this includes approvals of details, and now, and this is probably one of the things that we all need to think about most, it includes the need for on-site location-specific photographs to show and prove that details have been built as they should have been. And alongside this comes the power to pull down non-compliant work and the potential of an unlimited fine for persistent offence and infringement. So, these regulations are bringing a raft of law to make us achieve these higher standards and because of that, we are going to want to be absolutely certain that we've got all our ducks in a row and that audit trail of what we've done. So there is again the question of, well, how are we going to do that? Obviously, we, to a certain extent, we can, we can do this in manual ways with photographs, but there's the problem of proving where and when a photograph was taken and ensuring that everything is retained. Again, we really shouldn't be surprised that technology is going to be involved in the solution to this. Back in autumn 2010, really the first move towards the 2011 construction paper that was brought out by government and all that involved, including what then became known as level 2 BIM and so on. This was the first paper that came out, so we're looking at 12 years ago now. And very clearly indicated in this is the idea that BIM, building information modeling and management, and the management of information, plays an absolutely integral part in being able to deliver low carbon construction. So what are we actually talking about when we look at the role of today's technology? Well, I think the first thing is to say that once we have a decent model, a digital representation of our building, a twin of some sort, then and that has been coordinating classification, one can then use one's simulation tools, and there are bunches out there by different software authors, to assist with the design and calculation of heat loss and also the prevention of cold bridging. So again, a lot of them will give graphical representations of where problems lie. More importantly, I would argue, is the need to use your CD. Now, If we look at the standards which have been coming in recent years, ISO 19650 and so on, and then looking back to BS 1192 again, these standards all indicate that there is a need for a common data environment to be maintained. And this is so that the deliverables that are required from each party can be monitored, validated, and recorded. So that's the who's done what and when, or the golden thread of all of this information. So again, for the portion of work which relates to Part L, these are all processes and workflows that can be set up within your CDEs to record that. But this demand now that we record whether our details have been built as designed places a very great demand then for your mobile site-based platforms. So that's stuff like, you know, Viewpoint Field View and so on, that allow you to take a photograph which has either a QR-related location or a geo-related location and is dated, and to make all those forms and processes on site mandatory and provide you with that centralized audit trail of everything that you can do. So I'm now going to hand you on to the real experts with this and just say thank you very much. And that's me done.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Ben. Before we move on to the next speaker, thank you very much also for your overview of the changes. I mean, one thing that there's a lot of refurbishment going on at the moment, isn't there? So I was just really wondering, have there been any changes to consequential improvements? That's where if you improve a part of a building, it triggers the requirement to upgrade the energy efficiency of the rest of the building. Have there been any changes with that?
I'll let somebody else answer that one.
Okay, thank you. Okay, maybe let's move on to our next speaker. So it's over to Austin Bates from Ramble. Thank you very much, Austin.
Great, thank you. I'm assuming you can see my screen okay?
Yes, it's great, looking good.
Good. So hello, yeah, thank you. My name's Austin Bates. I'm a director with Ramble. We are a multidisciplinary engineering consultancy. We're founded in Denmark after the Second World War, but we now operate globally. We've got about 1,300 technical staff operating out of the UK. My role is within the Sustainable Solutions team. So we focus on delivering building level sustainability strategies, including performance, carbon and circularity and compliance, and certification. We have a dedicated analysis and digital team as well that develop tools, work with software in support of these focus areas. So I was asked to provide some commentary on the arrival of new Part L, particularly from kind of a Ramble engineering perspective. So very pleased to be here. Thinking about where to start led me to reflect on the journey the industry has been on in the past 5 years, and where we need to get to if we're to deliver on our net zero carbon ambitions and create lasting positive environmental and social impacts. And we've seen significant movement in policy to align with the government's ambitions to be net zero carbon by 2050. In terms of Part L, which purpose is to support improving the energy performance of buildings, then this is the final update of regs to come into force before the Future Home Standard lands in 2025. So there's high hopes this standard will deliver on ensuring all new homes will produce significantly less carbon emissions. Post 2025, that's 75 to 80% less carbon emissions than homes delivered under the previous regulations. But that's only 3 years away. So the question in our mind is this a sufficient stepping stone to bridge the net zero carbon requirements for post 2025? So on that basis, I'd just like to start with a few comments on new Part L. There are requirements for improved fabric standards, and picking up on the question just now, certainly that they do apply for kind of retrofit consequential improvements, which we can pick that up later in the questions. But the fabric energy efficiency standard does remain an important metric to ensure that a fabric first approach is taken to reduce the demand for energy in the first place. That's really important to ensure that the building demands for energy are reduced in line with the reductions estimated by industry required to allow the grid to be fully decarbonised, whilst also keeping the lights on. Secondly, a key change to the legislation is obviously the carbon emission factors that have now been reduced for electricity. So that means a fully electric building could be considered to be up to 70% less polluting when compared to the same development against the previous regs. And this is because the previous regs used an outdated carbon factor dating back from 2012, when the national grid still had reliance on coal-fired power stations, largely disappeared now. So the real carbon factor for grid electricity has therefore been low for some time. So with these revised carbon factors, it means that low carbon power can be sought from heat pumps. With the advent of Part L, which was released, the new Part L that was released last month, we were very keen to get hold of the software to get under the bonnet of it and better understand the implications of these changes. However, only kind of the first tranche of software was released, and we feel that hasn't provided really enough time to fully get to grips with the impacts of this new legislation. That's really important. It's the approved software that can only be used to quantify what the change is. These calculations are used to generate energy performance certificates. They form core requirements for planning authorities and their targets. For example, in London, this is the 35% improvement over a compliant building. And the same for BREEAM as well, which the mandatory credits are linked to that kind of methodology. So we work in delivering new developments. So without sight of the impact of these changes, it's meant that we've found ourselves in a position where we're not able to fully establish this in good time. So we do hope, and I'm sure along with our peers, and would welcome that we're engaged sooner with the next iteration to allow us to test the implications of this with a bit more time. Kind of bit more kind of reflections really on this iteration of Part L, and there are three things that I feel are worth noting. Number one, I lead the sustainability performance building performance team at Ramboll. So I've asked myself whether these regulations will push better performance within the building stock. From a net zero carbon point of view, to do this, you really need to understand your energy and carbon impacts from your development. So if we're heading to deliver a truly net zero future, then we would have liked to have seen inclusion of committing to an operational energy target, and also the quantification for embodied carbon impacts for the development. And hopefully the proposed amendment that's been put forward by industry to building regulations called Part Z is adopted. But either way, we do need to seek to address these requirements for embodied carbon assessments, limiting carbon emissions, and also catalysing broader circular economy considerations, because they'll be really key tools in delivering net zero carbon. Second point, I think we as an industry absolutely need to get on with delivering a better product. On my way to the train station the other day, I was noting a street of terraced houses, and on the left-hand side, there was a terrace constructed in circa 1890-ish, and on the right-hand side was kind of late 1990s, early 2000s. I am generalising here, but I can't think of an industry where the product has actually got worse over time, with the exception of a kind of recent uptick in that product. Looking at that, the modern product clearly had smaller windows. They couldn't open sufficiently to provide decent ventilation or daylight, lower floor heights, impacting on user experience. So, I welcome these regulations in seeking to address the kind of energy, carbon, better performance bit, but actually making sure that we consider the impacts of these regs on well-being, such as overheating, which is, of course, something we've all been experiencing a little bit this week, and next week we'll be experiencing next week. Making sure that the improvements to Part L in fabric efficiency doesn't have any unintended consequences for overheating. That's a really important point that was made earlier as well. There have been updates to Part O and F of the regulations to cover these aspects. So my point is, just don't consider Part L in isolation. Make sure that we're considering developing buildings that create great user experience and, of course, resilient to warmer weather. And finally, the point really around digital, and it was, in terms of, I would say, having this software in terms of the SAP software more in advance of the regulations dropping would have created more opportunity for those consulting with clients to be able to provide better assured guidance. Yes, before and after modelling was carried out on unapproved beta versions, but of course, there's no assurance until the final approved software lands. So it's obviously great it's landed now, but let's hope that any future software updates are handled that allows the industry to get to grips with this implication with a bit more time, and ensure that should ensure necessary skills and supply chains can be put in place to enable the follow through and delivery. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Austin. So just again, before we move on to Peter, quick question for you. I mean, you now got the final version of SAP, and you've been using the beta version. Are there any differences? Have you presumably rerun the calculations? Are there any differences between the beta version and the final version, or are they coming out pretty much the same?
We're just getting to grips with that in terms of my own viewpoint. I know that the team are kind of ahead of that. It's as I'd say, it's broadly similar, but it created some has created some nervousness not actually having that approved bit of software to hand with a bit more, particularly, that's the software that's used for generating, for example, EPC certificates. We're also, as an industry, dealing with the future MEES requirements, the minimum energy efficiency standard requirements, which are mandating EPC-Bs from by 2030. And actually the differences to the software can actually paddle that EPC up and down potentially quite significantly by grade. So it's created some nervousness in the industry. But now we've got it, it's great. We can go to market and we can consult with clients with much more assurance on that.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Austin. So now on to our final speaker, Peter Roberts from St. George and St. Joseph. So over to you, Peter.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. And hopefully you'll be able to see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, you got that. Right, marvellous. And so what I would like to talk to you about this afternoon is perhaps from a little bit from a developer and a contractor's perspective, because that's kind of the organisation that I work for, and that is my my expertise, as it were. I've worked all my career in contracting. So so there's the rather natty title that the approved document use, which is called Reporting Evidence of Compliance. And what does that mean? Really, it means about how we're going to record that we've built it correctly and how we're going to prove it. So Ben used the term earlier about golden thread, and it's absolutely relevant to this, and it's not just a building safety issue. I know Dame Judith sort of coined the phrase, as it were, but it is very much relevant to this standard and this regulation to make sure that the documents are accessible, reliable, up to date, and accurate. And that's what we need to be able to do going forward. What is the three elements that they're looking for within the regs? Well, there's the Building Reg England Part L report, or the BREL report, which is what Austin was referring to earlier. And there's the design stage report, and there's the as-built report. Now, I'm not proposing to go into those in any great detail. That's Austin's bags, not mine. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the photographic evidence that is required. There is this requirement to issue them to your SAP assessor, as well as building control. However, it's building control is the one that signs it off. The SAP assessor has to, I think, just acknowledge that they've got them, but the ultimate sign off comes from the building control. So what does it ask for in the regs? It says photographs should be taken of typical details, one per detail for each property, a close-up detail when necessary, and there's a little bit more detail on that I'll go through in a second. They should be done as the stages come to completion prior to closing up. So in other words, this is a direct quote from the regs to ensure that we take that photo before it gets covered to prove that it's being constructed properly. Also, in my mind, it is about that you're using the correct product as well. So for me, it's all about can we prove that the correct product has been installed properly everywhere? And that's sort of a term, and that's the way it's going. The Future Home Standards, I think, has kind of alluded to that sort of standard that they're expecting to see. That's what we're going to have to be going down and proving in the long run. So photographs, they need to be digital and high res. They obviously good quality, which of course is perfectly feasible with great cameras on tablets and phones now. That's not so much of a problem. It does say that where necessary, do take some close-up pictures, and you may even need to take more than one image of a detail if you need to. And I'll show you some examples, and all through this, I'll be showing you examples of photos that you can be taking. So this one's obviously the insulation within the floor prior to the screed going down, and let's not forget that insulation, of course, is required on a 6-sided box, not just a 4- or a 5-sided box of most buildings and apartments, of course. As was mentioned before, geolocation is another requirement within the regulations now, it's about that also, making sure you've got the date and time stamp on the images as well. And they ask for the file name should include the plot number and the reference, etc. So there's lots of ways of doing that. One way they suggest within the regulations is to put a code on it that relates to the B7 standards, and I'll show you some of the B7 standards in a second. Yes, you can do that. There's also the ability, if you are using a field application, then, and I'll put an example across the banner at the top there, you've got a lot of that information captured within that field app. So I think it'd be a question of a conversation with your building control officer to make sure that they are happy. And as a default as well, as you can see in the photo, where we're taking the image down the cavity to show that it's clean. Here, the bricklayer has also put the block reference and the elevation that he's on that note that in every photo. So when I was looking through this, in every photo, they had that ID within there to show as a backup exactly where they are. I quite like capturing that a lot of our contractors use whiteboards, an A4 whiteboard, where they write the grid line and the block number and the level that they're on. And some of them even put the date in that as well, even though it's date stamped on the photo. It's just giving that extra level of assurance that this is where it is, and it's a photo of that particular detail, and it's you know, appropriate to that building. It's not just a stock photo that they've uploaded. So couple of things that really haven't changed between the standard, the old regulation and the new regulations. You know, they both talked about continuity of insulation. We do need to be able to prove that we've put the insulation in continuously for the reasons that are on your screen at the moment there, which again is a direct lift from clause 4.14 of the regulations. And I think pretty much we're all familiar with the reason for doing that. Similarly with thermal bridging, it was mentioned before, there's a little bit more emphasis on it now. And so how are we treating that? So the example I put on the screen there for you is actually, if you're not familiar with that sort of detail, that is a stub bracket coming out for a balcony, a bolt-on balcony, which of course is a huge thermal bridge coming through the structure. So we do have to think about it at design stage, and we do have to then show that we have put the thermal breaks in as designed. And so it might be that in some instances a photograph like this is a little bit too generic. We might have to take a photo before actually that stub bracket goes on, so that you can see that the thermal break is there. That's all things that we need to develop with building control to make sure that they are happy with the level of detail of photos that we're going to be giving them. So I mentioned before the B7 requirements. So B relates to Appendix B, and Part 7 of that. They go through 6 specific areas that they're really interested in for us as developers and contractors to capture. So the first one is your subs and the like. I've put a generic detail in on that one because I couldn't actually find within my organisation a photo where we've actually captured that up to now. Under the old regs, we didn't have to. So we will do, obviously, when the new regs come in on our developments. That's the sort of detail we need to be capturing. So an external door threshold, for example, we need to be able to demonstrate that we put that thermal break within that sort of detail. We need to capture the external walls, and in particular they're asking for the ground to floor wall junction and any structural penetrating elements. So again, we're going back to that thermal bridging to a certain extent. Now you might be wondering, why, Peter, have you put a photo of an empty cavity in there with what is the cavity barrier, the fire barrier picture there? That's because it's blown insulation, and the regulations actually specifically say for blown fill, you will need to take the photo of the cavity being nice and clean, and the ties so completely clean, because of course you can't take a picture of the blown fill insulation. So that's the sort of thing you need to be showing. The third part, B7, is at roof levels to show that continuity at the junctions in particular that they're interested in. They're the sort of details that, in addition to the general photo of the loft space insulation, to show that that's continuous, we need to be focusing on those joist and rafter level and eaves and gable edge details as the example that I've shown you there. And then for openings, similarly, okay, you know, the windows are going to be in, you know, that's a bit of a no-brainer, but what building control are going to be interested in is that window positioning in relation to the closer and so on. We do need to you know, identify where these are. So this is a good example on this photo. You've got the date and timestamp, and you also have the geolocation on that one. So that's the sort of where we're going with these photos. That one does show it quite nicely. Air tightness. And so for the previous 4 sections of B7 it relates to, so that's what it's talking about. We need to show the air tightness, but if it's not otherwise obvious, we need to be putting that in. And so the example I'm showing you there is the ETPM detail round window lapping on to the calcium silicate board on an SFS construction. And so you know, it's important. Air tightness has been around for a long time. The new regs have changed the requirements there. And then the last one on B7 is building services, and a fair few things in there. You know, not only just showing that the pipework's been installed, but they're to support the information that's going over to the end user. There is photos of the plant and equipment that's being used to show building control and the SAP assessor that what was specified as the means of heating has actually been installed. This particular example is a heat interface unit. So that's the regs. And so how does that kind of apply to how we're going to achieve this in practice on our developments and our projects? The first thing that I would recommend is that we do include the requirements of the regulations within the quality inspection and test plans. It's not going to happen by chance. There is quite a lot to take on board, quite a lot of places where we need to have hold points, where we need to be capturing the insulation with those photos that are required. Let's make sure we capture it on the QITP and make sure everyone understands that's what they've got to do. And, you know, again, whilst we're still understanding what building controller are going to be exactly looking for, I would recommend that we talk through what's in our QITP and get building control's view on what we're proposing at an early stage, rather than find we've got a problem later on. The second part is to devise some quality check inspections records, and within that, what we do is write very specific questions about what it is we're expecting to see if we're going out there to inspect it. So my test is, could I be given the tablet, not knowing the specification, could I go out there and could I inspect that it's been built to the correct details and the correct specification? So within your field application, you know, if you have the ability using forms, in this case, to write the questions as the check, as the aid memoir, then that question is prompting the contractor and the person that's then signing it off to ask the right questions, whether it's been installed correctly. And as I said before, it's about proving the correct product has been installed properly everywhere. I always like to see a photograph of the product that's been used. In this case, this is a genuine photo that I've extracted, where we took a photo to match this question have we used this? Is it the right product that's going in? The guys took a photo of the label of the pack of insulation to demonstrate, yes, that's the right insulation, it's the right density, etc., that has been specified. And then thirdly, it's about in all part of your preparation before you let people loose with loads of cameras and taking photos of anything that doesn't move, is to benchmark what would be acceptable photographic requirements, agree that with building control, agree that with your SAP assessor, but not part of the regulations, but I would recommend this as well, also agree it with the warranty provider. And then obviously that then needs to get relayed to the contractors doing the work so that they understand exactly what they're doing. And the example of the mock-up there, that benchmark detail that you see, is a classic way, a great way of communicating it to the workforce to show them how it should go together and what they should be recording. So that's about me done. This is, if you like, now a requirement from the regulations to capture quality records, which they're not a new thing. It's been around a long time. ISO 9000 that I quoted there has said about quality records for a very long time. It's just upping the game. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Peter. Had quite a few questions about the crystallographic regime. I mean, I suppose just give people an idea of what this involves. I mean, on a typical sort of, let's say, 2-story house, or maybe, you know, two bedroom apartment. I mean, how many photographs do you think you need to take and kind of tag and?
Right, good question. Now, the regulations say 1 per detail per plot, and so that. And plus supplementary ones for you know, any close-ups as required. That is quite light touch. We typically on an apartment block, we would have, say, for example, the bricklayer on an elevation on one level, so probably covering half a dozen apartments perhaps, could easily be taking 120 photos. It is very quick and simple and easy to do using the field applications. Now, sometimes not all of those photos are terribly useful, and also those photos are also capturing other elements which are just as important to show have been installed correctly, like the masonry support angle and the cavity trays, and of course the fire cavity barriers as required by Part B. So yeah, there's a lot of things that we're capturing there, not just the thermal insulation. But to answer your question, you're probably talking perhaps a dozen or so photos at the very minimum per plot for just the thermal insulation bit.
Right, thank you. And I mean, following on from that, who takes the pictures? I mean, do you have a clerk of works person doing it, or do you say to the people doing the different elements of work, say that we mentioned the bricklayers or the window installers, do they take the pictures? And if so, do you have to then give them common standards to work to?
Yeah. So within my organisation, we ask our contractors to do that, and the larger trades usually employ a quality manager to work with them and their supervisors to take the photos. The smaller contractors, it's often the supervisor that is taking the photographs. That then gets offered to the site management team to review and sign off that the records have been captured appropriately. So it goes through a hierarchy of controls. So the contractor opens the form that we've set up collaboratively. It gets completed by them. It's when they're happy that they completed it, they offer it. we call it available for inspection. Other terms are available. That's then the prompt for the site management team to review it, sign it off, or go back and ask for more evidence or better photos. Once everyone's happy, it gets signed and closed, and then we've got that record in perpetuity on the cloud that we can always refer back to if we need to.
Great, thank you.
And it's that evidence then that we would need to pull out the relevant bits for building control and the SAP assessor under these new regs.
Okay, and I guess the big question, I mean, this is probably go to you first, Peter, but I mean, I'd like everyone else to sort of express an opinion. I mean, the purpose of taking all this photographic evidence is to address the so-called performance gap where buildings don't perform as designed because of various issues to do with their construction. So by taking photographs, you've helps kind of up standards, if you like. Do you think that this new regime is going to improve the building performance of completed homes?
Definitely, absolutely. I think by the contractors taking the photos themselves, they're taking responsibility and accountability for building it correctly, and there's nowhere for them to hide. Most people want to do a good job, but unfortunately sometimes there is the temptation to perhaps finish something or cover something up that perhaps isn't quite as it should be. It takes that away. They can't do that anymore.
Right, I see. So as a house builder, it's a real bonus to you, not a burden then, by the sound of it, potentially.
Well, long term, it's going to mean less latent defects, less issues for our customers, and everything is moving in the right direction. We're building it right first time. Thank you very much. We've sold a really good product that everyone's happy with, and it stays that way.
Okay, great. Yeah. And I mean, Austin and Ben, I mean, do you have any sort of comments to make about this new regime, or do you think we should be doing more to tackle the performance?
I think I would say something, which is just that in so many of these advances, the technology bit, as we heard about, actually the assessment, the heat loss assessment softwares, which are certified, coming out only just in time, if in fact just in time. I think the nice thing about the site photographic evidence is that this is all completely established technology and software as far as we're concerned, and all of these processes of taking these photographs, making them specific to the time and the location, and also all of the approvals processes showing who's done what and when, and that it's gone to the next person to approve. And indeed, you can include, you can invite the building regs assessor into this as well as the final step of a form process. So you can be sure that the same process for the particular locations is always happening. So the nice thing from my perspective is, yes, this is a new raft of stuff that you've got to do, which will improve quality and so on as well. But it's not something that you're waiting for the technology to come along for. It's all there, basically. This is stuff that's already there and established in ways of working. Would you agree, Peter?
Sorry, I'm still on mute. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. And I mean, another issue, I mean, you've got all this, it's great that you're collating all this information. I can see there's clear benefits, but it's well known that building control is suffering from issues with recruitment and overwork. Are they really going to check all this, or are they just going to park it somewhere on a server and that'll be the end of it?
I can't answer that. I don't work for building control. Yeah, yes, you know, they are stretched and they can't get out and inspect things as much as they can. But having the photographic evidence of anything that they're unable to come out and view. And we've had this with building control on some of our developments where they've not been able to come out. They are happy to view the electronic records as the next best thing.
Right,
So
I see.
It might help them.
It could be, yeah, obviously saves them a journey, so to speak. They can be just kind of doing more. Yeah.
And I think the other thing I would say is that even if sadly they are overstretched and aren't able to do quite as thorough a job as you would hope they would do, were there to be a problem at some point in the future, because you've got that complete digital record and that golden thread of information, it can go back and be assessed even at a later date.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, incredibly valuable. And in terms of delivering a better product, a better quality product, this will feed into that. And the work we're doing, a lot of work with clients who want digital twins of their buildings, and just having data tags, data points that are able to capture this information into that digital model will be incredibly invaluable.
Okay. I want to turn now to sort of the extra costs of the fact that you've got to not only take all these photographs, but also you need higher energy standards to hit your carbon emission targets. I mean, how much does it cost typically for, again, I'd have to sort of say 2-3 bedroom house or 3-bedroom apartment? Or how much extra does it cost? And where is that cost going? Is it all going on this photographic compliance regime, or is it elsewhere on, I don't know, more insulation and better performing windows?
I can take that for starts, Marta. I mean, yes, there will be additional costs that's been reported. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that you have to do now that you didn't have to do beforehand. Whether it's photographic evidence for the install, whether it's providing more air pressure tests for every dwelling, say, as opposed to a typical dwelling. And for large developments, that will be of material impact. We know also costs for installing heat pumps with dedicated hot water cylinders for most dwelling types are typically more when you compare it to a baseline, which is a gas combi. Which that technology is not fit for purpose going forward. So there are immediate costs now, but we can expect the supply chain to mature to bring these costs down. We've seen technological advancements and better supply chains from the previous iterations, solar installations, LED lighting, triple glazed windows, now significantly cheaper today than when it was in 2013 when the last iteration of the regs was updated. And I would say the key thing in the regs, particularly about relating to reducing maximum flow temperatures and heating systems, from 75 degrees C to 55 degrees C, what that will do, yes, it might mean that it provides the opportunity to retrofit that home with a heat pump. It will mean the radiators will be 30% bigger, perhaps, to provide the same amount of heat. But actually, with the right design choices and approach, actually you can reduce the size of the radiators by providing a more efficient building. I mean, I would also say timing is important. So if your project falls under the new Part L, then mobilise those early studies to help understand where the impact of this is from a design and cost point of view. Invest in digital tools, right? You can rapidly test at the design stage the suite of components and systems that will deliver on the regs requirements, and seek out efficiencies that way, and offset the costs where possible.
Okay, Ben?
Can I just add, I think when we talk about cost like this, it is vitally important that we take a whole life view of what cost really is, not a view of what the design and construction cost is alone. Because really it's when we look at that whole life cost that we really look at the impact of what we're doing now. So yes, we may be spending a little bit more now, but that is resulting in whole life cost savings.
So that begs a question then, Ben, doesn't it? Because I mean, under the model we have in this country, a house builder will build the house and then sell it. And then that whole life cost picture is split between, obviously it's the builder who's got to build it, and then the benefits which accrue down the line are enjoyed by the person who buys that property. So the question is, and I guess this is really for you, Peter, you know, there is going to clearly be extra costs of meeting these more rigorous standards. Given the energy crisis and the increasing bills, do you see this now as a way to reclaim some of that whole life value, that in that you can sell a property for more money because it's going to save the household money over the long term?
It's certainly a selling point, and you know, a lot of things within developments you know, can be a selling point, and this is certainly one of them. But the other thing that I think should be taken into consideration, certainly from the contractor's point of view, is that yes, there is a cost to putting this in, both with material cost and supervision cost. However, by certainly on that extra supervision and getting the quality right first time, there is the hidden benefit of not having to go back and sort out issues, latent defects and issues at a later date, because we've got cold spots, we've got damp, and we're having to go back in and take someone's new home apart. That will hopefully become very much the rarity going forward, because we are ensuring the standards of build are so much better. Yes, I think some of it will go on to the bottom line of the sales cost, but also I think some of it will also be a saving on the additional cost of not having to have a contingency in place to sort out problems. Right.
Okay. Great. And I had a question coming about, I mean, this is clearly a complicated area. Someone's asking, is it realistic for a small builder, you know, someone that builds one-off houses, maybe 3 or 4 houses, sort of SME house builder, are they really going to be able to cope with this?
The regulations don't say that you have to, you know, subscribe to using a you know, field application that obviously has you know, a license cost and you know, a bit of a you know, an admin cost in terms of understanding how to use it. There's absolutely no reason why you can't take these photos using a standard phone.
Right, I see. So it's not necessarily going to be a challenge. And do you think the higher standards would be a challenge for them, or is it just a matter of kind of getting used to it?
Well, one would hope that everyone, whether it's an SME or a FTSE 100 developer, they're all striving for high standards. So.
Okay. And I mean, looking ahead, I mean, I think you touched on this in your presentation, didn't you, Austin, about the future home standards in 2025. I mean, do you think that this step now, the 2022 step, is the big challenge, and the step at 2025, people have sort of kind of got used to it, or do you think the big step is yet to come?
Yeah, I can. I think, you know, so from 2025, the future home standard will require CO2 emissions produced by new homes to be 75 to 80% lower. So that's a significant step. They'll be zero carbon ready with no retrofits, and ultimately the grid decarbonisation will provide zero carbon performance. What we do know from this set of regs, we've got a better idea of the formats of what the future home standard may take, particularly around the 3 metrics. So primary energy consumption would be a key metric for delivering performance, along with carbon dioxide emissions and the fabric energy efficiency standard. So, you know, I think the step change in this new regs is important to mature the supply chain, the skills to deliver on that. Obviously, the next iteration is TBC as to exactly, you know, the details of what it will look like. But we've got a good idea, we think, in terms of the general structure. Hopefully, in any kind of software update that's required for the future home standards, would welcome a bit more of a lead-in time ahead of that release, just to make sure the industry is fully aware of any, you know, the details of that at a compliance level.
Okay. Peter, Ben, have you got any comments about that? No?
Nothing to add? No.
Okay. Well, believe it or not, we're pretty well out of time, actually. We've been going for an hour. So I'm going to have to draw this session to a close. And I'd just like to apologise to everyone out there who's put forward questions. I know there's an awful lot of questions, and we haven't been able to answer them. It's a huge topic, and we could probably spend hours and hours and hours on talking to this. So yeah, I do apologise for that. But I would like to thank our speakers for a really interesting and informative session. And to all our listeners for listening. And one final point is there will be a survey that will pop up on your screens after the presentation, this session has ended. And I would really appreciate it if you could fill that in. It gives you an opportunity to say what you thought about today's session. So thanks to everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.